And I think truly you need a buy and build strategy. There are parts of that you may, and for good reason, end up building yourself, but there is a big buy component to it, because it should not be something you go in and do in your own endeavor. And then there's actually one thing, and sometimes I describe this as being the white space in your architecture. That is orchestration. Like if you were to draw out a composable architecture, you often draw like a bunch of circles, and then you draw a bunch of circles for the heads and the front ends. What about the rest? In a monolithic architecture, that was the runtime of the monolith. Shared database, it's the actual runtime of the solution and so on. That white space is what we need to fill with something flexible, not glue, but something flexible. And there's a best of breed approach to choosing the right pieces to put into that white space. The orchestration for the front end, for the experience, the low code, no code, proper tooling for observability and health, for the actual correlation and tracing. Like there's a bunch of components that goes into that white space. It's not a single solution either.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you mentioned the monolith, and the fact that technically on the monolith model, their claim to fame and why they've worked so well historically is that they did have orchestration built in. They orchestrated all of their systems together, and you bought the platform and it was like, wow, this is all orchestrated very nicely and working together. The trick now came with composability, where people are trying to swap things in and out, because that was a locked orchestration kind of model that was like for those.
Actually, I don't 100% agree with you, John. Like, I think one of the reasons why we moved away from DXP was because as soon as you started to use more than like a couple of the features, then they didn't actually work as well as people thought.
I think each feature didn't work for the use case of that customer. I think they worked well together, but the use case for that specific customer, for that platform, e-commerce or whatever that component may be, wouldn't work.
Yeah, and okay, so kind of splitting hairs on that, but yes. So what happened? And I think that's one of the reasons we have a lot of folks that are still using DXPs, because they actually do work for their specific use case, but they can't change. And I think one of the things we get caught up on composability and orchestration is talking about swapping systems out. I think we talk about that too much, because people don't really want to swap systems. They just want to get the right one for their
work together.
There are some systems that are more swappable than others. A tax system in a commerce stack, that's a market condition. There's a compliance element. In a global enterprise, you're orchestrating multiple of those. And you're doing it for good reason, whereas there are other systems that simply aren't swapped as much.
And so, like, what we really want to be able to swap out is like probably either add more front ends. Like, I want to put my content in front of more people in different places, TVs and phones and whatever, that was a thing. But I also want to change that as that technology evolves, because it evolves really quickly. And I think that's where we saw this happen, like in around 2018 was where, like with Jamstack, folks were like, I want to swap that out and get onto new versions. And people that have started doing that are like, they're on new versions like the day they're out, with like versions of things like Net.js or whatever. Whereas our customers that are on .NET, they're still on .NET from like 2014. They don't change that. So it's interesting that it is a real mindset shift to kind of get into this. But I haven't seen as much of a mindset shift for, say that 10 times fast, mindset shift, for getting into orchestration and composability. So it's like, it's a harder one to get into, and I'm not sure why. And I know that for me, this leads a little bit into Netlify, because I looked at how Gatsby did their data layer. It made you do a data layer based on GraphQL that actually pulled your data into that thing and then changed it. And to me, I hated it at first, because it meant that, I like the way I do data. I don't want to do this GraphQL thing. But then it actually forced me to think about that data, that content in a slightly different way, and look at, we can pull all of this stuff into this layer. It's actually stored there, which is a little weird, but it's fine. And then it was used. And I think Netlify, I'm segueing into your stuff here a little bit, Chris, but that to me was a mindset shift for me personally, for how I was helping to help customers work with their stuff. But I'm not sure that I agree with actually storing all the data in the orchestration layer.
Can I actually help you out on that one, Chris?
Or just a second, but you get your little snippet in there, and then Chris, we want to hear from you.
No, definitely. But I would just want to add something to this. So I think there is two parts to orchestration. One is to make the data that you have in the back end available to be orchestrated with an API. And then the other part is to actually do the orchestration, like stitching the data together and connecting the dots and actually giving the front end a view into the back end data, right? So those two are two different things. Even in our platform, we actually have two modules. One is very similar to Netlify Connect, which opens up the backend data, especially from legacy systems that currently don't have APIs, to make them available for orchestration. And then the second part is the real-time engine that is actually going and pulling data live from different systems, stitching it together, and then making it available to the front end in a way that the front end requires it to map to the data model and the object model of the front end. So I think when we're talking about it, because a lot of times this issue gets confused, and I want to separate those two capabilities within orchestration. And now, Chris, with that.
Yeah, what's your take on this one?
No, so I think the original question back then was when is orchestration a good idea, right?
Like again, a layer, like a specific layer that needs to be built.
Yeah. So I mean, like, so
the front end.
So the first thing is, like, you know, let's look at the traditional way of bringing things together and bringing something live, right? You need to pull in your CMS and your content and your payment and all those different microservices, right? Then you need to bring them into one build. And then, you know, once that published, you have your system administrators that needs to spin up staging environments, right? They have their own ticketing systems. They have their own sprints. You have the same for database administrators. Now you have DevOps sitting varnish caching. Now you have infrastructure engineers doing all those things, right? And that's why it takes 4 months to move that blue block from here to here, right? And it's sort of, I think that's the first thing that Netlify also went out to solve for, right? Because otherwise we would, you know, Paul Graham once said, the founder of Y Combinator, that this way of building was the fixie bike of the internet, as in it had a solo use case, right? It had one gear only. And it was true because there wasn't an ecosystem, right? But also because there was no viable workflow. There was no orchestration. And so Netlify was sort of the first attempt at being able to orchestrate all of that into one workflow, right? And so even if you just have, let's say, contentful comms tools and it's a Greenfield project, you can go and click a button and be done, right? Or you can build out something that really will take a lot of cycles to do the same, right? And then I think when we talk about the next level of orchestration, then I think when you have, like, for example, we work with companies that have, one of them has 600 brands in 200 countries. So you can imagine the number of digital executions that are unique they put out every year. It's about 100,000, right? And so if someone comes and tries to pitch them one solution, like one CMS, they smile, right? Because like, what about these developers in Brazil that's never heard of your product and can't get relevant developers and so on, right? And so when they're trying to, now we have hundreds and hundreds of different properties that run on very different components of Mach that is run with Netlify. And they sort of wanted to say, okay, well, how do I get that workflow, right? This abstraction, a way of having to run all that operations to run infrastructure. There's such huge saves in it. Our time to market is a fraction of what it was. On average, with Netlify, enterprise clients deploy 28 times a day, and that's up for once a week before us, right? It's not because the software is 150 times faster. I really wish it was, right? But it's because of how much is automated and abstracted away. So, well, can we get the same guardrails and governance and compliance and the developer provisionings and so on, but across different kinds of projects, right? That aren't just, you know, Mac, but maybe some of them are more legacy and starting to get headless, and having a workflow and an orchestration out there where it's more sort of saying, hey, we have all this product data in a spreadsheet. We want to, I don't know why it does that. Sorry. I don't know. I can't turn it off, right? And I speak with my hands, which is an issue for me, right? But, you know, that has to travel through and be easily accessible. And like, you have vastly different content sources, right? And so when you mentioned Gatsby for that middleware, right? When we looked around, they were the first ones actually trying to solve this. And so that's why it's now part of Netlify, and we brought it out as, you know, kept building on that and making Netlify Connect, right? It's also why we have something as Netlify Create, the stack bit, which was saying that the visual editing, which I think, and that's a great example, right? Of saying, hey, if you have one content management system and that has a visual editor, that's native to that content management system. It's much better to use that. I would suggest that myself, to be honest, right? But once you start pulling from different content sources, that's when something like that can really start making sense, right? And And I think that's the notion, right? The more you have to orchestrate, and you do, if you're trying to approach this, adopt this at scale, the more you need that next layer of orchestration, right? But even for Greenfield singular project, you will definitely need orchestration in order to succeed, right? So it's just like, what kind of orchestration are we talking about, right? And yeah, at scale, you're going to need more than that. And I would say for the no-code local, one thing that really interests me is this notion that traditionally in enterprise software, right? We all come from a place where things were sold over the top of developers. They had no buy-in. They're just like, hey, this is what we're using, right?
Yeah.
There's this notion that well, there's a few sort of specialized IT experts and admins that know sort of how it works and they can help out with this, right? And I think the reality is that once we are really starting to sell to enterprises that are doing this at scale, the version of real no code doesn't exist to the extent that you don't have to open the lid. They all do, right? You will have to come in. And so it really matters what that code looks like and how the development process is, how is it built? Does it fit into your Git workflows? Does it fit into everything else, right? I think even in our no-code experiences today, understanding modern development, understanding how developers work, making sure it fits into how they're developing everything else becomes super important, right? Because I do think that there's no-code applications out there that are great if it could keep no code, but as soon as the lid is open, it's sort of like, what do we do with this, right? Like we don't even have someone speaking that programming language or whatever it might be, right? So I think there's actual real code considerations in no code applications as well to take into consideration. More so than there used to be, right? When I started my career, there wasn't really the case, right? You were just looking at it from a different functionality point of view. But yeah, I think short answer, orchestration is important in the very beginning and at scale, but different considerations around the orchestration is required.
Yeah, and I think you just said